Hi, Julian.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm good. So we have the room about half full right now. We're just coming back from lunch, and I'm going to give a brief introduction to the panel, and then it'll be over to you, okay?
Okay, perfect. Great.
Cool. All right, I'm going to get started because the rest of the folks can just miss my little spiel and get Julian. My name's Julia Kaganskiy. I'm one of the hosts for the IMG Forum here at MUTech this week, and I'm also moderating this panel, which is a real pleasure and privilege. Thank you to HOLO for organizing this panel, which was really an exciting one to see in the context of this festival, and I hope to see more panels like it. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kaganskiy, or Mohawk people, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. I think this fact is important for us to be reminded of, especially in the context of this panel, as climate change and the existential threat that it poses to all life on Earth is inextricably tied to the very same colonial forces that displaced the Kaganskiy and their way of life. The legacy of colonialism is by no means behind us. And as we discuss the role of art and artists in today's environmental activism, it's worth keeping in mind that the patterns of injustice that have shaped the Anthropocene, or the Plantationocene, Capitalocene, Cthulhucene, whatever name you prefer to give this geological epoch of man-made global warming and ecological collapse, those same patterns are still very much with us and still influencing the way we collectively respond to this colossal challenge, or fail to. The data is pretty damning, as I'm sure you all know. Last year, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change gave us 12 years to drastically reduce our carbon emissions in the hopes of meeting the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming benchmark set by the Paris Agreement. Researchers advise that keeping our rising temperatures under this number might help prevent irreparable damage and forestall the worst of the drought, floods, extreme heat, poverty, famine, and mass migrations that are already underway in many parts of the world. Grappling with the enormity of the task before us and the short time frame given by the IPCC is daunting, of course. And yet the reality is proving even more dire than our climate models had predicted. This summer, we've witnessed the hottest year on record, once again, bringing 42 Celsius heat waves, that's 108 degrees Fahrenheit for my American friends, to Europe and causing Greenland's glaciers to melt at a rate that models had predicted for the year 2070. Paul Beckwith, an Ottawa-based climate scientist, now predicts the first blue ocean event in human history, the advent of an ice-free Arctic, for sometime between 2020 and 2023. The likely result of this event would be soaring temperatures due to the loss of albedo, the Arctic's crucial reflective ice mass. As our leaders struggle to wean the global economy off fossil fuels, and some governments roll back environmental protection measures altogether, some scientists are advising that we start considering near-term societal collapse as an inevitability, as opposed to a worst-case scenario. Still, for most people, it's difficult to reconcile these facts with our lived experience. For much of the Western world, despite the headlines and the heat waves, life continues to carry on as usual. We get up, we go to work, stress over deadlines or money troubles, fall in love or out of love, spend time with friends and family, zone out to some Netflix. Even those of us who believe that climate change is a serious problem feel powerless to change it and, crushed by the enormity of this planetary scale crisis, are prone to succumbing to anxiety and depression or plotting the location of our doomsday bunker. But even so, there is still some hope in the dark. Over the past year, we've witnessed a groundswell in environmental activism with groups like Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, and the Youth Climate Movement leveraging direct action and civil disobedience. This panel is about the role that art and artists can play in this collective relief effort. I'm delighted to be joined by an incredible panel of artists and cultural producers assembled here today by the wonderful HOLO team. First, we'll hear from critical engineer and artist Julian Oliver, who's joining us remotely from Berlin. In addition to his long-standing critical art practice, Julian currently serves as the systems and security architect for Extinction Rebellion International. Later on, we'll hear from Heather Davis of the New School in New York, who literally wrote the book on art in the Anthropocene and has a forthcoming book on petrocapitalism that looks incredible. Following Heather will be artist and educator Ellie Irons, who uses socially engaged art, community science, and urban ecology as a means for envisioning and enacting multi-species solidarity in the face of climate chaos. And last but not least, we'll hear again from Joanie Lemercier, who presented earlier today in this room, who will share a very different side of his practice and activist work with us. So each of the panelists are going to give a short 10-minute introduction, and then we'll have a moderated panel discussion following with some Q&A from you all, of course. So with that, Julian, take it away.
Great, thanks so very much for that, guys. That was actually a stellar introduction and a little bit, I guess, similar to my own here. I guess I'm just going to be echoing some of those things. I thought I'd first start by saying that I'm a bit sad I can't actually be there in Montreal. I'm very much a fan of the city, and I'm actually just trying to cut down on my carbon miles. I have got a terrible carbon guilt. I've been at MUTEC before and was very warmly welcomed and had a wonderful time. So I wish I could be there. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I started out in about 1996 doing this whole checkout thing and have been doing it really ever since. But over the last sort of 10 years or so, as anyone that knows me well, I suppose, or is unlucky enough to be following me on Twitter, will know I've been relatively obsessed with the planetary boundaries question about where we are going on a planetary scale. And this, I guess, comes from sort of systems thinking and systems engineering, really, that you start to look at larger scales of problems, of challenges, and how they interact. But what has become very much clear to me in recent years is that it is totally possible for our current way of life to cease, that there is no evidence things are going to be okay. There's, again, that linearity to life, the myth of it, that our pattern way of living will only repeat itself, that we get up in the morning, we eat, we get dressed, we head to work or school, the studio, etc., and then we repeat it. We are trained and train ourselves to invest in a future that is safe, pensions, retirement, and savings funds, as though some sort of guarantee. And yet all the while Earth, the very substrate of it all, withers away from underneath our feet, and we have nowhere else to go. All of this culture we've grown and are growing, on top of so much work and thought, has itself fed from a planetary abundance that, for the first time in history, on any civilizational scale, is actually retreating. We are sleepwalking toward a precipice as we ever further invest in a linearity whose persistence no evidence presently supports. Even as we in the West find it near impossible to avoid scientific fact warning us of the ravine, we so often find ourselves digging further inward, investing in cognitive dissonance. Why? Because it is simply too unbelievable, too unacceptable, and too painful. Perhaps the most endemic of all myths, in fact, is that the world was put here for our use. It's what we stand on. We are born into it and we die into it. It's known to us at both ends of our life cycle. But that it might become alien to us, a world unable to support the human project, all our work, just simply cannot be. And yet that's what's actually happening, unless we do something about it. There's no evidence otherwise. Now I'm just going to switch over to some slides now real quick. One moment. I hope you can see that. Yeah, so let's jump into it. Let's just go for it. There are two things that will deeply affect your life. There's climate change and the lesser known mass extinction. As Christelle Vu said on Twitter not so long ago, biodiversity collapse is the bus you dodge only to be hit by, or climate change is the bus you dodge only to be hit by biodiversity loss. It's really what we're not looking at the moment, so I thought I would actually start with it. In 2015, it became scientific consensus that we have in fact entered the 6th mass extinction on Earth, the last being 65 million years ago. What does it mean? What does mass extinction really mean? Well, we know the dinosaurs and how they died out. I mean, there's a popular idea that it was an asteroid, but in fact, it was also warming involved in that case too, significantly, in fact. But Typically, there is a loss of species, a species decline of around about 1 to 5 species a year. And that's what we've observed for the last 65 million years looking at fossil records. We're currently at about 27,000 species a year, one gone every 19 minutes, according to E.O. Wilson. Now, that's considered to be a conservative estimate. It's by the so-called father of biodiversity itself, but the man who really coined the term. The UN has a slightly more pessimistic view that every day up to 150 species are lost. That's about one every 8 or 9 minutes. Global populations of birds, fish, mammals, amphibians, and reptiles declined by 58% between 1970 and 2012. This is incredible. We are actually living amidst this very much a crisis, whereby the Earth grows quiet. In Europe, it's been relatively frightening on the continent, where 75% decline in flying insects, or flying insect biomass, in just 27 years. And it's dropping at about 2.5% a year. As one biologist put it, we humans will never see the ends of the insects. We'd be gone before then. We're absolutely dependent upon insects, not just for pollination, but actually even keeping our fresh water fresh. They're the glue layer within our ecosystems. We like to think it's warming that's a result of this, well, it's causing this at least, but in fact it's not. It's only responsible for about 7.1% of species decline, according to numerous reports, including the IPBES report of this year, IPBES, where they really look at the whole Earth system and its impacts of anthropogenic causes. Really, the bulk of it is this: we're replacing wild with the animals we like to eat, effectively. But also, it's their food. Here is the Amazon basin, for instance, being converted into a soy plantation, specifically for soy meal fed to animals. Europe, for instance, is the second largest importer of soy meal from the Amazon basin. This is displacing indigenous tribes, literally wiping out cultures. It's part of it. It's a genocidal driver in Brazil. And this is, for instance, a palm plantation going in to that horizon. But then when we get to warming and we start looking at these, these big smokestacks, you start to wonder where the Paris Accord is now. I mean, the Paris Accord has failed. It was a non-binding, non-obligatory agreement, celebrated at the time, prior to obviously a massive amount of lobster lunch and no doubt some awful music on the hotel dance floor, but nothing happened. I mean, there's no single government is living up to its obligations. We are headed at the moment well above, in fact, the 1.5 degrees centigrade that we had supposedly all agreed on, and there's every suggestion that, in fact, we're heading toward even as high as 3.5 and 4 degrees before the end of the century on our current, given our current policies. When I was born, it was about 330 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. I guess from that you can work out how old I am, I suppose. But yeah, that's what it was then. And I mean, on July the 1st, I didn't get the most recent one. I've been busy, I should have done that, but it was 413.76 ppm. That's quite a jump, especially when you start looking at what's really happening. As the introducer mentioned before, I mean, this is Greenland. This is a sign of a planet going into a deep and long fever. This is a prediction. What we're looking at right there is a prediction that was supposed to happen at the absolute worst in 2070. We are 50 years, we're half a century ahead of the game. That's because we don't really understand the self-reinforcing feedbacks that increasingly have hold of our climate. There's so much about this planet we don't yet know. And here is a rather moving one from Iceland on the disappearance of a great Icelandic glacier. It was called OK, actually. I mean, the poetry of that, I mean, you can't get past it. OK is the first, Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and we know what needs to be done. Only you will know if we did it. 450 ppm, 2 degrees centigrade, what does that really mean? Well, here, for instance, is a bit of Taiwan. Now, 2 degrees centigrade is kind of close. 2 degrees centigrade is 450 ppm. This is, this here is Miami. It's almost entirely underwater. Don't fly to Miami to see it before it sinks if you haven't been there before. That would be kind of perverse. This is Shanghai. I mean, where will all those people go? The IPBES also imagines a 700 million people population displacement by around about 2050, even though that figure is, that date is probably also retreating. Technology, it seems, will certainly not save us. There's been a lot of interest in what's called negative emissions technology of sucking carbon out of the air. Sort of looks like this. This is a Swiss implementation, but we're nowhere near gigaton scale emissions capture. Would take just this unit alone, which is actually multiplied by a few times, a year to capture even a single flight from here to Australia. And there's been a lot of research on this. 450 ppm, 2 degrees centigrade means another thing, however. It means a kind of a practically guaranteed tipping point whereby no amount of science, no amount of research or technological innovation afterwards will save us. We can't turn around after 2 degrees centigrade. We're on autopilot to 2.5, to 3, to 3.5, and to 4. And here's what 4 looks like, according to a piece in the New Scientist. Basically, all of Europe is cooked out, or at least mid to southern Europe is cooked out. Where will all these people go? I mean, there's already geostrategists, military strategists talking about what will happen in Canada. Where will the US go? West Antarctica blooms, supposedly. And this is considered to be before the end of the century. And before that time, of course, we're thrown into famine and war. I mean, this is just all quite horrible, obviously. There's this guy here who's one of the most renowned atmospheric scientists with his 3,000 citations and his name on something like 130 papers. He says that, that at 4 degrees centigrade, the Earth cannot possibly support, doesn't have a carrying capacity to support anywhere near the populations we have today, just in fact a few thousand people living in the Arctic or Antarctica. This is indeed pretty grim. But we have a choice. We have a choice to end the despair and to get busy. This is 15,364 scientists from 184 countries, the most to ever sign a scientific document in all history. They wrote in their second warning to humanity this is their best advice. As most political leaders respond to pressure, scientists, media influencers, and lay citizens must insist that their governments take immediate action as a moral imperative to current and future generations of human and other life. With the groundswell of organized grassroots efforts, dogged opposition can be overcome and political leaders compelled to do the right thing. That's got most of the world's living Nobel laureates on that paper. 1,000 utopias and we have no planet B. I mean, Mars is at 949,000 parts per million CO2 and we're getting worried at 413. We are, and we should get worried, but we're not going to go to Mars. In order for there to be any space program at all, as countless voices are saying, we need to have a very, very healthy Earth. More than 50% of all of our pharmaceuticals and active clinical use come from irreplaceable natural sources. We can't even grow a few generations of broccoli in space. Insects. I'm almost finished, but Kate Marvel, climate scientist, said this beautiful thing. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness and are not worth less for it. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of the happy ending, and that's what we need to get to. There's no hope without action. Developers, front and back developers, curators, artists, and engineers, it's time to rise up. As Christophe Bonneau, the research director of the CNRS, France's foremost scientific agency, said, another end of the world is possible. Okay, I guess I can leave it there. I just would like to really, again, implore you as a moral imperative to take the wealth of skills that you have and make this a topic. Make this a topic in your work. I met a woman recently who's a very senior UX and front-end developer. She just said to herself, in recognition that everything is falling apart, she could not ignore it, and she's applying herself to help grassroots movements grow and come up with platforms, new solutions to help people mobilize. I guess that's where I'm at. I hope that's not too bleak. Again, no hope without action. I find a tremendous amount of energy in that, in the essence of that, and look forward to a future. Thanks, guys. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you, Julian. Best of luck to you in Berlin. Anyone who is not already following Julian on Twitter, highly recommend it. It's a great resource for some of the latest and greatest and most depressing headlines, but also certainly an inspiration as far as someone who's really dedicating his skills and his expertise towards pro bono contribution to activist organizations, something that he's been doing for a long time, but most recently with Extinction Rebellion International. And up next we have Heather.
Thanks. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, great. So thanks so much for, oh, no, okay. Better? Okay, we'll just ignore these ones. Okay, so thanks so much for having me here, and thank you, Julia, for that amazing introduction, and also to Julian for providing, I think, a lot of the incredibly necessary context for thinking through what we're facing, essentially, right? So what I was going to present is just sort of 4 different kinds of artistic strategies that I've seen various kinds of artists come up with in order to tackle or try to think through on different levels the kinds of things that we're facing. And I love this quote, which is from 1971, and it seems incredibly prescient. And it says, it's by Youthant, and he says, with all their genius and with all their skill, they ran out of foresight and air and food and water and ideas. And actually, when you read the larger quote, I'm cropping it because I think it works, I think, more for our present moment. But basically, what he was saying is that he doesn't want future civilizations to have said that about us, right? And I think that one of the things that's incredible about artistic production is that it does the ideas part of this. And what we actually really vibrantly need is alternative kinds of narratives and imaginings and worlding structures that people can attach themselves to that don't just that aren't just the kind of xenophobic right-wing nationalisms that we're seeing on the rise everywhere, right? So these are just a couple of examples. I'm sure you guys will be familiar with many of them. This one I still find inspiring. This is from Liberate Tate, and it started as in a workshop in 2010 at the Tate, and there was numerous kinds of actions that took place under this kind of rubric of performance artists who got together to really talk through what does it look like for museums to disinvest and from fossil fuels. And what I think that is incredible about this is that they were successful. So in 2016, BP announced that it would end its 26-year-long sponsorship of Tate, and even though this is a very small gesture in the midst of this incredibly large systemic issues that we are now facing, I think it shows the fact that as cultural workers, as cultural producers, we have a lot of power in terms of creating images, creating other kinds of worlds, and pressuring the institutions that also significantly have a lot of power to really think through what our worlds could look like differently. Another project that I really love, sorry, I'm just going to show you guys 4, and my apologies if I'm talking really fast. I tend to do that. But another project that I love that perhaps some of you might be familiar with is Amy Balkin's 2004 to 2012 project, Public Smog. And one of the reasons why I love this project is because it operates as a proposal. So there's 2 parts of the project. This one here is when she tried to get the atmosphere submitted to the UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. And what would that mean if that was taken seriously, right? It would actually mean that we would have to stop all emissions as they are now, because we would have to put the same kinds of effort that we put into protecting places like the Taj Mahal or other kinds of buildings around the world that we consider vital to our cultural heritage, that we would to the atmosphere. And you know, she did actually send this to all of the people who sit on on the UNESCO World Heritage Site Committee at the UN, and only one person responded, and I believe that person was from Tuvalu, if I remember correctly, and said that they supported the project, but obviously it would never go through. But the question is, why is that so obvious, right? Why is that we refuse to have this kind of action, right? Why is it that we take seriously cultural heritage in other forms, but not in the form of the atmosphere? The other side of the project that I think is incredibly provocative is that she used the other part of her work in this public smog project to buy up all of the polluting emissions markets that industries use in order to buy and trade various kind of pollutants, right? So that they can pollute more, but by buying these trades on the market. And she bought up entire sections of them, and then retired them. So because of that, essentially what it works in the same way as strike debt or other kinds of strategies for being able to buy up these kinds of emissions markets and then literally take them off of the market. And by doing so, she creates what she calls this clean air park over Los Angeles. And you can see that the air isn't so clear in this picture. But what would happen if we scaled this up, right? I think that what's interesting about this particular project and these two iterations is that I think it has the potential for asking us, what are the other kinds of interventions that we could be making, right? And so that's one of the other projects that I love. The third project that I'm going to show you is on an entirely different scale, and this one is a work by the artist Terika Hapoya, and it was in the 2012 Venice Biennale. And what she did was she created these boxes that obviously have a relationship to the kind of size and shape of a coffin, and she put these leaves in the boxes, and she added forest carbon dioxide sensors on the outside. And so when you listen, it's actually meant as a sonic piece, but when you listen to it, what happens is you literally hear the earth breathing. And the question that she asks with this piece that I think is so provocative is, what would it mean if instead of just being confronted with a situation of climate change by way of this barrage of facts and statistics and numbers, which are incredibly important, and I'm very in support of that kind of information being circulated. But at the same time, I think a lot of people find that type of information alienating, and for two reasons. One is because I think that we're trained to be told that unless we have certain kinds of scientific training or scientific understanding, that we can't possibly begin to either interpret those numbers or we can't possibly begin to question them or intervene in them, right? And so I think, and then the other reason I think is just that there's this kind of barrage of statistical data, right? And what I think this project is getting at is, what would it mean if we pulled this entire carbon system into our bodies? What would it mean if we were thinking about the circulation of carbon, not just as an abstract entity, but rather as something that is a living, breathing system that we are all actually contributing to? What would it mean if we really started thinking about the ways in which those emissions are literally killing the air and the water around us, right? And I think that that's what projects like this are inviting us to do, and they're inviting us to think through the kinds of problems of the Anthropocene, or the kind of ecocidal, capitalist colonial ecocidal moment that we're living through, as one of a complete shift in our sensory apparatus, right? If we are living now in a world that is significantly hotter, this means that our entire sensory system has been reformed and remade, which is the reason why I think artistic projects are so incredibly vital and important in relationship to all of the other activism that we need to do, is because we need to rethink how we are literally physically moving in the world, and how we're actually taking in information, and how we're thinking about the questions of aesthesis or perception in relationship to these things. And then I'm just going to end by showing just a brief video, or section of a video by the artist Christina Battle, who in 2010 did this project called Bad Stars, which had a number of components to it, and one component including a sort of series of discussions. And one of the components that's a part of this, oh, it's not showing. Is it possible to get the computer back on the screen? It's my camera. Oh, how did that get turned on? Sorry, everybody.
Where's your presentation?
Where's my presentation? It's right here.
And try to slide it on the second screen. I'll do it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. In any case, so you'll just have to kind of imagine this for the moment, because this isn't working. But so for the sake of not eating into everybody else's time, the reason why I love this piece by, I'm just gonna go like that. The reason why I love this piece by Christina Battle is because she takes up this question of Sarnia and the air quality in the region of Sarnia and Amjawang First Nation. And so for any of you who do not or are not familiar with that part of Canada, it is known as Canada's Chemical Valley, and there's all kinds of effects that are happening in the populations that surround that area. But one of the reasons why I think it's an important site of really thinking through these questions is that, just as sort of Julia and Julian both pointed to in their remarks, is that colonialism and capitalism are not incidental in relationship to climate change, right? Like, often we talk about climate change as like, oh, it's unfortunate that populations that are not responsible for the drastic and brutal effects of climate change are the ones who are feeling it first or feeling it the most. Really interesting thinkers such as Kyle White of the Potawatomi First Nation have very coherently argued that actually what we're seeing is not really something that's new, but rather the amplification of the actual processes of colonialism that have been ongoing for at least the last 500 years. And that we can think about climate change rather as the weaponization of the atmosphere rather than as just something that's an incidental event, right? And thinking through this piece by Christina Battle is that she shows this weaponization of the atmosphere, and she shows the ways in which technologies such as satellite technologies are implicated in the ways in which we're imagining and imaging those kinds of these events. And so to really take seriously not just the kinds of political and other kinds of strategies, artistic strategies that we need to do the work in order to end climate change, but we also need to do the work of thinking through, radically thinking through, what does it mean to live in a settler colonial society, and how has settler colonialism always been a project about changing the atmosphere, always been a project about changing the hydrosphere and the biosphere. It has never been anything else. So I'm just gonna end there, thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. Really appreciated those last few comments as well about the weaponization of the atmosphere. I think that that's something that I imagine most of us have not really heard of or considered. I mean, I will certainly raise my hand at that. So it's an important framework for considering this problem that I think is underutilized. Up next, we have Ellie Irons, whose work focuses on urban ecosystems, specifically urban plants, which she uses as healers to help stabilize and build soil. She's going to tell us about a recent project called the Environmental Performance Agency.
I guess I'll use this to make sure I'm heard. Thank you so much, Julia, for the introduction, and HOLO and MUTEC for having me. I feel like I've been really well set up by what Julia and Heather already put forward, so I'll just jump right in. Oh, I had my notes for a second and then I lost them. I think I have to start again, sorry.
There you go.
Thank you, and sorry for the delay, and thank you for your patience. Try to be precise here now that we're running. So my talk is the Environmental Performance Agency, Eco-Social Art, Public Fieldwork, and Ecologies of Disturbance. And basically, okay. I'm gonna talk today about my work with the Environmental Performance Agency, which is a collective. It would have been great to have all of them here today, but It's just me. There are 4 of us. I'm an artist and amateur ecologist, and I combine urban ecology fieldwork and community-based art projects, hoping to cultivate in myself and others the kind of environmental awareness we need as we navigate climate chaos and the 6th extinction. I want to grow and strengthen environmentalism that centers ecological equity and multi-species solidarity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal practice, and then we'll jump right into the EPA, just for some background. So this practice grows out of a deep engagement with urban ecosystems, where I focus most closely on spontaneous urban plants, which are also known as weeds. And these are the kind of plants that thrive in landscapes that are heavily disturbed by human activity. And I see them as healers who, in certain contexts, can stabilize and build soil and provide the foundation for regenerating a thriving multi-species habitat post-disturbance. And I got into this work through my ongoing feral and invasive pigments project, where I harvest the petals, leaves, and berries of spontaneous urban plants and make them into watercolor paints. I make paintings about the natural cultural lives of these plants, and I teach others how to do the same through walks and workshops, where we explore not just paint making, but also consider the implications of wildness and weediness, migration and belonging, and what urban biodiversity looks like under late capitalism. I've come to call this form of working in public, attending to and demonstrating care for underappreciated, often damaged urban ecosystems as public fieldwork. I see it as a performative gesture that says ecology happens everywhere. I'm entangled in it, and so are you. Projects like this one have led me to connect with other artists who work with plants and weediness, and to expand my practice in a more explicitly activist direction. For the rest of the talk, I'll focus on the work of the artist collective, the Environmental Performance Agency, which I co-founded in 2017. We came together from a range of backgrounds, design, choreography, environmental engineering, and we named ourselves specifically in response to the proposed defunding of the US Environmental Protection Agency. And this is us demonstrating in front of the US EPA in Washington, DC in June of last year. And we were actually trying to nominate our weedy collaborator, mugwort, also known as Artemisia vulgaris, to the EPA's Science Advisory Board. As we say on our website, appropriating the acronym EPA, the collective's primary goal is to shift thinking around the terms environment, performance, and agency, using artistic, social, and embodied kinesthetic practices to advocate for the agency of all performers co-creating our environment, specifically through the lens of these spontaneous urban plants, be they native or migrant. So we use dance and movement, but we also use soil testing and plant identification in our work. For our first year, we had our urban weeds garden in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. This was on the site of a former auto body lot, which was rewilded by co-founder Andrea Hengi, seen here. We worked together to develop strategies for learning from and with spontaneous urban plants, framing them as our mentors and our guides. And while we had this space, we spent time out in the surrounding neighborhood doing public field work. We worked in the public eye, demonstrating engagement with and care for disturbed urban ecosystems. We did plant surveys and border crossings, developed scores for radical care sitting, a creative care practice of encountering the realities of toxic and polluted sites, and experimented with soil liberation tactics that helped us connect with the latent potential of the earth hidden beneath impermeable surfaces. And even when necessary, debated the merits of interring poisoned rats deep in the heavy metal-laden soil of our urban weeds garden. We lost that urban weeds garden in January 2017 to real estate development. Sadly, it's actually now under asphalt. So we've been mobile for the last year and a half. We facilitated embodied scientist parkour on the Schuylkill River with the Penn program in Environmental Humanities in Philadelphia earlier this spring. We built the Department of Weedy Affairs at Transformer Gallery in Washington, DC, which included a weedy resistance walk on the National Mall and that mugwort nomination that I mentioned earlier. And One of our more recent projects is an EPA training about acute air pollution in industrial Brooklyn and its implications both for plants and people. So we actually trained new EPA agents to wash the leaves of plants living near a cement processing plant near the Nurture Art Gallery in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And the gallery component of this project also included a score. We often use scores to kind of change the way we move through the landscape or through a space. So this score was a set of instructions for confronting the 70+ rollbacks to environmental regulations that have taken place under the current US administration. But you could also lift this long scroll of rollbacks and read a smaller list of, at the time, 11 pushbacks to the rollbacks where they haven't gone all the way through. I've learned a ton from this group about how movement, choreography, and kind of these multisensorial fieldwork-based ways of knowing can expand what for me was a primarily visual artistic practice and also really help it get outside of the gallery or the academy. And I've also been forced to grapple with the efficacy of this kind of intimate fieldwork-based gestures that we do alongside the desire and the imperative, as we were hearing about earlier, to be part of fomenting massive structural change, like now. So as we experiment with these exchange-based forms of pedagogy and plant-human communication, environmental regulations, as you know, continue to disintegrate. So one example of an attempt to engage the political process directly is our platform On Behalf of Life. This is a web project and workshop series that encourages folks to submit comments to the US EPA through regulations.gov on behalf of another life form. Campaigns have included the Environmental Protection Agency's strategic plan of last year, which was a disaster. Also the banning of neonicotinoid pesticides and the recent strengthening transparency and regulatory science, all super problematic regulations or proposals. So we make workshops around these to learn about the regulation or deregulation and then engage with local plants to think about how human and non-human bodies will be affected by the proposed change. And then we craft comments on behalf of plants, insects, microbes, what have you, who can't communicate by typing in a web form. And we submit them using a custom-built interface that delivers the comments directly to regulations.gov, which makes them part of the public record. So this is a comment submitted by one of my collaborators, Andrea Hengi, on behalf of horseweed, which is this amazing plant indigenous to this continent, but despised as a superweed because it was one of the first plants, or maybe the first one reported to have developed glyphosate resistance. So that's a tolerance to growing in Roundup-ready soybean fields, disrupting Monsanto. And as the EPA, we've generated comments, numbering in the tens or, maybe up to 50. But Dan Pfeiffer, who's my husband and also a collaborator on this project, was able to take this model that we developed together and actually take it to the American Civil Liberties Union, where they're now delivering comments electronically. So kind of a nice segue there. Of course, we would love to see them doing it on behalf of non-humans. They're not at this moment, but perhaps someday. So at this point, we're more than 2 years into working together and more than halfway through the tenure of the administration that prompted our founding and beginning to focus on what the US EPA will look like under the next presidential administration, which will be elected in 2020. And as was mentioned earlier, there's been this ascendancy of groups like the Sunrise Movement, the Poor People's Campaign, Youth Climate Movement, Extinction Rebellion, that situate environmentalism as inextricably entangled with social justice and climate equity. This is really exciting for us, and we see our focus on multi-species solidarity and weedy resistance as complementary to these movements. So to wrap up, with our sights set on 2020, we're holding a core member retreat in just a few days when I get back from this, actually, to work on developing an outreach campaign and a series of eco-social interventions. We want to grow the coalition of embodied scientists, activists, spontaneous plants who are reimagining federal responsibility and agency in the face of climate chaos. Asking what would it look like to completely reimagine a failing federal agency, not just push back the rollbacks. What would it look like to replace Andrew Wheeler with a team of spontaneous urban plants. And critically, how can we hold the perceived absurdity of that ask in place in tandem with our earnest belief that weedy plants have tangible, practical, and actionable wisdom to share if we can attune and receive it? There's humor here, a kind of Dadaesque whimsy that has a long tradition in avant-garde art, but we're simultaneously dead serious. Really. We believe that this kind of friction and tension can lend vital insights in this era of protracted environmental crisis. This is a multifaceted crisis that began well before us, as Heather pointed out, and will carry on long after we return to the Earth, but it demands action now, and we need a multiplicity of strategies. So we're keen to explore how these tactics for engaging deeply with damaged urban ecosystems and the plants that heal them, can help us in imagining and enacting ecosocial possibilities. Okay, I'm done. That resists monoculture myopia, investing instead in multi-species solidarity. So thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Way to overcome adversity and deliver an amazing presentation. Last but not least, we have Joanie Lemercier, who's going to share some of his recent activist work as well. For those of you who were at Joanie's presentation earlier this morning, I think this will be quite a departure from what you saw earlier from the light-based projection work and installations that he's known for. So I'm excited for him to share this with you.
Okay, never mind. So, hi everyone, sorry about the delay. So first, as a sort of introduction or like background, this is what I sort of explained a little earlier today during the talk. In the past few years, in order to sort of get away from the computers and from the projection and from my activity as an artist, I started spending more and more time in nature. And I started also trying to sort of capture the sublime and these emotions I had in the wilderness. So to make this sort of creative and efficient, I used the drone to do 3D scans of this volcano that you can see. And I sort of developed a set of tools as an artist with, like the drone, the little robot to draw, and also a laser that I used to do some projection outdoors with battery pack. So I think over the past 2 or 3 years, I wanted to get away in the nature. And to be honest, this experience has moved me a lot. I sort of reconnected with myself a bit and, you know, sort of trained some sort of introspective work, and that generally helped me being a bit more sort of sensitive to my own emotions. And so that's just the background. It's sort of unrelated to my fight against coal mine. So this is completely different and sort of dissociate from my artist work. It's more of something I do on the side. And so I live in Brussels here, and by accident, I heard about the largest coal mine in Europe, which is actually just 1 hour and 40 minutes from where I live. The weird thing is I've never heard of it before. I thought coal was this dying thing and there would only be a few coal mine like on the decay, maybe far away in Poland or in like South East Germany, or like quite far and quite abstract for me. So when I heard about this coal mine, I couldn't quite believe it. So I decided to go there and see it by myself. So on the way, you start seeing more and more like coal plants and these big chimneys. And just the journey itself, this like 2-hour drive is really gloomy and really weird. You feel like you're stepping into a post-apocalyptic land. It's all gray. There's a lot of pollution. You can barely breathe when you get close to these coal plants. So we can't see very much. I'm sorry about that. And then you can't see anything at all. But and then when I got here, I discovered this big hole, which is basically 8 miles long, 8 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide. And in the back, what you see here, it's not clouds, it's actually the 4 coal power plants that are just around the mine. So it's easy for them just to extract and burn the coal right away. So what you see here is a bagger. It's a big machine that's being used to dig the ground. And when I got there and when I saw this, I can't explain exactly what happened, but something clicked. It's so monstrous and it's so devastating that I finally understood what I've heard for the past 30 years about the risks we're facing and the danger of the CO2 emission and you know all these things that don't really that are a bit abstract. So I started this series of pictures and drone images. It's a shame we can't see anything. I'll post some of this on Twitter later. And so I started being a little bit obsessed about this coal mine because it's just outside where I live. It's the largest source of CO2 emission. Every second, 3 tons of CO2 are emitted in the atmosphere. So I started being a bit careful over the past years to sort of reduce my impact and maybe go from 20 tons to like 10 tons and reduce my flights. And I did all these efforts. And every second, there's so much CO2 emitted there. So basically, I was shocked. And bear with me if I'm a little, if my emotion takes away a little bit. But I feel rage, I think, and hopefully that's what I want to sort of communicate. There's an emotional component of emotion that I think is very important if you want to do something about it. So this is the forest of Ambach. It's 12,000 years old. And it's being cut because there's coal underneath. So activists moved into the mine, into the forest 8 years ago, and they live there. There are about 50 of them, and they're basically trying to stop the forest from being cut. And we don't really hear so much about this, but I found it, yeah, like I'm really obsessed now. I really want to go there, and so I do go there, and I sort of met with the activists, and I did some research. This is the coal mine seen from Google Maps. So this is the forest that's left, which is probably the best way of storing and capturing CO2. And we're just cutting it off, and the mine is expanding. That's the big one, but there are like 4 other mines around. And the German government announced earlier this year, we're going to close the mine. So all the public went, oh, okay, it's fine, it's good. But it's actually 19 years from now. And they're working 24/7, just digging the coal and burning it right away around it. So I did this small, so I do a lot of drone images, drone videos, and I try to create sort of impactful images to sort of convey that emotion I have. And this is the real-time emissions of this mine as we speak. It never stops. It's 24/7. So there are like 12 of these machines. They are 300 meters long. You can see a car, very small here. So, yeah, I really want to do something about it. I don't have much, there's not much I can do, but I'll try whatever I can to do something about this. But yeah, so you get the idea of this CO2 emission thing. So if it was just there, I guess it wouldn't be as shocking and maybe I could sleep better at night. But the fact that the coal mine is expanding because they only have 19 years, so they're speeding up. They're investing a lot of money into this mine to get the most possible coal out of the earth. So what you see at the you don't see anything. So there's a little village at the back, but it's being raised as well. This is the church of Immerat. It was raised. It was demolished in January last year. It was 130 years ago, I think, built in the 19th century. Okay. So I find it a little bit paradoxal when a lot of companies and people are like supporting giving away some money for Notre Dame because, of course, it's heritage, it's something we have to preserve. But the same companies that are giving a bit of money to Notre Dame, they're also funding the machines that are actually breaking those churches. And I'm not a Catholic. I'm not very much into religions in general. but what it means in terms of heritage, in terms of the world that we built, and the world that is running and that we let run. So yeah, those are the three main supporters of the mine. I'll talk about it later. So last time I went to Emirat, I did this drone picture. And again, I don't know if the image conveys any of the emotion I felt, but there's something really worrying about the world we live in. And like, I'm not a hippie, I'm not anti-capitalist, I'm not really a radical person. I'm like, I gave 5 or 10 euros to Greenpeace for 10 years, but I'm just like a regular, average person. But I just realized after seeing this that I haven't done anything about the planet for the past 37 years, and I feel really bad, and I really want to start doing something, whatever it is. So anyway, this is another church. It's set to be demolished in a couple of months, in about 6 months. So now I'm trying to do something. I'm not sure how and why and what. This is the last mass. I think when I saw all older people attending that mass, and they were like crying because that's the church where they were married or where they do the baptism of their children. When you see them leaving the building crying, there's something really that clicks, and you really want to sort of try doing something about this. So yeah, to sum up, like I think connecting emotionally with these problems, I think is probably a starting point to do something as an artist or as a citizen. Or what I find fascinating about this particular project is that it covers not just one issue of like CO2 emissions, but also it covers heritage, air pollution. 1,800 people die every year from air pollution in this area. So that's 1,800 deaths. And it's just fine. It just carries on, and no one does anything about it. And it's going to carry on for the next 19 years. So, and this machine is as a symbol, I think it's quite strong. It's sort of eating the earth. That gives you an idea of scale. You can't see anything. Okay. So it's very big. It's in terms of engineering, I think that's quite amazing. And while doing some research about the machines, I found this PDF on Autodesk website. You probably know this software company. I'm actually a huge fan of what Autodesk does, the software they do. So I was a bit surprised to see that they call this like a success story. And from an engineering point of view, I think that's true. But from an ethical point of view, I think there's a problem. I'm going to skip through really quick. So I was so angry that I got in touch with the CEO. He replied to me. We started this fight. Then he stopped replying, and he sent me the person from his foundation. We had a 30-minute call. I explained everything I showed you and asked for some feedback. I had to read them their own policy, where they say their policy, they have to identify and measure the environmental impact of their operation and products, while at the same time they're responsible for this amount of emissions. And we had a follow-up call with this person, and they canceled it because they've decided that another discussion is not a productive use of our time. So when you sort of confront people with their own policies, I mean, they wrote that policy, and when you confront them, they just don't want to hear about you anymore. So what I realized is I think that those companies and government, they're not going to help us. If we don't do anything as like human beings, citizens, if we don't move, we're going to face starvation in the next years. It's hard to say if it's like 5, 10, 15 years. It's either us or our children. So we should probably try something at least before we starve. So I tried different creative approaches. I use Autodesk tools to do 3D scans of the village. So I have like 53 million points of every tree, house, and the church. And I'm not sure how to use this data, but I might do a project about it. But so I like the idea of using their tools also. 2 minutes. I try to do projections. So there's definitely a problem here about making profit has more value than heritage. So I try to I'm very bad at slogans, by the way, but I try. So I print stuff on a gobo, and I try conveying this message. You can't see very much, but in reality, it's brighter. So yeah, then I started trying to develop these projectors, because that's what I do, projection and light mapping and stuff. So I made this small portable device with a battery pack and a slide projector. And I started doing projections at the European Parliament. Not really knowing what to project. So first I had these really complex messages with Twitter handles, and it didn't really work. So anyway, my point is that whatever tool you use, whatever you do, there's always a way to sort of engage and invest, like cooking for Extinction Rebellion, or doing like anything is possible. I think we should not be shy about what the impact we could have potentially, and sort of start doing something, whatever it is. I think starting action is what we need right now. I got better at projection. This is a laser. So yeah, lasers are much brighter. So I could use that with groups like Gelände. So I think civil disobedience might be the main tool we have to make something happen. So I followed Gelände. They actually go on the tracks of those coal mines. They block the train and they prevent coal from being burned. So there's like a couple of thousand people, and they've probably reduced their own impact by like 1 million years. I mean, if you compare individual impact and what they've been doing. So I've been following them, helping them, sleeping on the train tracks. That's a weird experience. And I'm almost done. So there are definitely people out there. Again, like I'm new to this, I'm just starting, and I discovered I've never heard of Gelände before. So they're actually, running in the fields and going down into the mine to just prevent the machines from extracting the coal. And I think that's what we should do right now, like take action. It's probably the last chance we have to have a significant impact on the future of our children and the next generations. Okay, so as an artist, I support them. So I go on site and I do some projection, and I sort of just show some support. The response I had from people down in the mine, you can't see them, but it's like 4,000 people there, brought more emotions and more amazing feedback than most festivals and like great exhibitions. But I think the meaning I can find in these activities is quite amazing. So I'm going to continue targeting Autodesk, hopefully. They're just down in Montreal Airport, and without them, the coal mine can't run. Without their software, if they stop the licensing, then the coal mine is in big trouble, and that could reduce the coal mine life of several years, hopefully. I also encourage people to learn about Extinction Rebellion. They have a meeting in Montreal this Saturday. You could just go and like here and see if you're sort of touched or not. But I'm gonna invest my time helping several different groups, not just one, but trying to sort of bring my skills to create some actions. I'm planning to do something about Montreal, about Autodesk in Montreal. So feel free to send me an email if you want to just come along, and we maybe try to meet an executive there and just confront them with the numbers and try to just apply their own policies. So if you want to just help on Twitter or whatever, you can email me. And I'm sorry I've been so long, so I'm gonna stop it here.
All right.